Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a system today that, honestly, most of us probably don't think about too much. But we should. It's the human endocrine system, and it's running the show behind the scenes every single second. We're using this biology textbook chapter here, and, well, let's just say it's packed with info. We're going to break it all down for you in this deep dive, and I think you'll be amazed by just how intricate this whole network of glands and hormones is, keeping your body running smoothly.
It really is remarkable. When you really stop and consider it, it's hormones that are really orchestrating so much of what makes us, well, human. Everything from how we grow and develop to how we respond to stress, even our emotions are tied into this system.
It really makes you wonder, how do we ever function without even thinking about it all?
Yeah.
So maybe before we get into the really complex stuff, can we start with some basics, like what exactly are hormones?
Well, think of them as these tiny chemical messengers. They're produced in these incredibly small amounts by these different glands all over the body. And then they travel through the bloodstream to these, specific cells or organs. It's basically like this complex communication network regulating a whole bunch of different processes.
Okay, so it's not quite like our nerves, which send signals super fast.
Right. The nervous system is like high-speed internet, providing these really quick responses, but they're short-lived. But the endocrine system, well, that's more like sending a letter. Slower, for sure, but it's got a much longer-lasting effect.
So it's that difference between an instant message and a thoughtfully written letter. Both super important, but for totally different reasons. Our chapter also mentions how the definition of hormones is expanded beyond just those produced by the classic endocrine glands. What does that mean exactly?
Well, originally, scientists thought hormones only came from, distinct glands, like the pituitary or the thyroid. But research has moved on, of course, and we've discovered that other organs, the heart, kidneys, even your gut, they all produce hormones, too. It's a bit more complex than we originally thought, and that makes it even more fascinating, really.
It's like we're uncovering this whole hidden world inside our bodies. Okay, so speaking of all those glands, can we get a guided tour of the major endocrine glands? I'm looking at this diagram here, figure 19.1 from the book, and it looks pretty intricate, to say the least.
Absolutely. So let's start with the hypothalamus. It's this tiny but super powerful region in your brain. Think of it as the CEO of the endocrine system, sending out instructions to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is often called the master gland for a reason.
So it's all about delegation, huh?
Precisely. The pituitary, which sits in this little bony pocket at the base of your skull, it carries out all those instructions by releasing all sorts of hormones. And it's actually divided into two parts, the anterior and the posterior pituitary.
And there's a difference in what they actually do.
Oh, definitely. The anterior pituitary, that's the real workhorse here. It produces this whole array of hormones that influence, well, pretty much everything, from growth and metabolism to, reproduction. And one of the most important ones is growth hormone, or GH. And as the name suggests, it's crucial for growth. Too much GH can lead to, gigantism, and too little can result in dwarfism.
Wow, so that one hormone has a pretty big range of effects. What are some of the other key hormones the anterior pituitary is putting out there?
Well, there's prolactin, or PRL, which is essential for milk production in mammary glands. Then you've got thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, and that acts on the thyroid gland to regulate metabolism. And we can't forget about adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. It stimulates the adrenal glands to make cortisol, our main stress hormone.
So it's like each of these hormones is like a little manager with its own team and specific tasks to get done.
That's actually a great way to think about it. And then there are two more super important hormones from the anterior pituitary, luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH. These two work together to, regulate the gonads. So the testes in males and the ovaries in females, they're basically the directors of the whole reproductive system.
So they're making sure everything's running smoothly when it comes to, making babies.
Yeah.
What about the posterior pituitary? Does it make any hormones itself?
The posterior pituitary is more like a storage and release center, really. It stores and releases two key hormones that are actually produced by the hypothalamus, oxytocin and vasopressin.
Wait, I've definitely heard of oxytocin. Isn't that the Lev hormone everyone's always talking about?
It's definitely earned that nickname. Oxytocin plays a big role in social bonding, as well as in childbirth and milk ejection. It's the reason you might feel more connected to someone after a hug. Then you have vasopressin, which is all about regulating water balance and blood pressure. And if there's a problem with vasopressin, it can cause a condition called diabetes insipidus.
So one is all about love and connection, and the other's about, like, keeping our fluids in check. Both pretty important roles. Okay, so we've got the hypothalamus and pituitary covered. Where do we go next on our endocrine gland tour?
Well, let's move on to the pineal gland. It's this tiny gland tucked away deep inside the brain, and it's responsible for making melatonin. That's the hormone that regulates our sleep-wake cycles, also known as our circadian rhythm.
Ah, so that's why we feel tired when it gets dark and wake up when the sun's up. It's like our internal clock.
Exactly. And it's interesting to think about how melatonin levels can be messed up by things like, screen time and jet lag. That's why it's good to be mindful of light exposure, especially before bed.
Makes sense. So what's next on the list?
Let's talk about the thyroid gland, which is in your neck. It produces hormones like thyroxine or T4 and triiodothyronine, T3, which are super important for regulating metabolism, growth, and development. And this might surprise you, but a key ingredient for making a thyroid hormone is actually iodine.
Oh, so that's why we have iodized salt.
Exactly. If you don't get enough iodine, it can cause something called goiter, where the thyroid gland gets all enlarged. It can also cause hypothyroidism, which affects everything from energy levels to even your cognitive function. And in pregnant women, if they're severely iodine deficient, it can cause developmental issues for the baby.
It's amazing how one tiny element can have such a huge impact. Okay, we got the hypothalamus, pituitary, pineal, and thyroid. What's next?
Okay, so right next to the thyroid, you got the parathyroid glands. It's these 4 tiny glands that have a big job regulating calcium levels in the blood. They secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH, which increases calcium levels when they get too low.
So it's like this constant tug of war trying to keep calcium levels just right, huh?
Yeah.
Why is calcium so important anyway?
Calcium is, well, it's crucial for a lot of things your body does. Nerve transmission, muscle contraction, bone health, you name it. Without the parathyroid glands keeping things balanced, our bodies would be a mess.
Okay, I'm definitely seeing how interconnected all of this is. So what's next on our endocrine gland adventure?
All right, let's move on to the thymus gland. It plays a huge role in the development of our immune system. It sits behind the breastbone and it secretes hormones called thymosins. And those are essential for the maturation of T lymphocytes, are a type of white blood cell that helps fight off infections.
It was like a boot camp for our immune cells.
Exactly. And here's a fun fact. The thymus actually shrinks as we age. It's one of the reasons older adults are more susceptible to infections and also why vaccines might not be as effective for them.
Wow, that's fascinating and honestly a little scary. Okay, what's next?
Let's talk about the adrenal glands. They sit right on top of each kidney and they have 2 parts, the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla, that's what kicks in when we're stressed.
Oh, so that's where the fight or flight hormones come
Oh,
from.
you got it. The adrenal medulla releases adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, and noradrenaline, or norepinephrine. And those hormones get us ready for action by, increasing our heart rate, getting more blood to the muscles, sharpening our senses. It's that surge of energy you get when you're in danger or facing a challenge.
It's like our body's own little superhero serum. What about the adrenal cortex? What's its role?
The adrenal cortex is more about managing long-term stress and keeping things balanced in the body. It produces a bunch of hormones called corticosteroids, and that includes glucocorticoids like cortisol and mineralocorticoids like aldosterone.
So cortisol is for, dealing with that deadline that's looming over you, and aldosterone is for?
Aldosterone's super important for regulating electrolytes, especially sodium and potassium. These electrolytes are key for maintaining fluid balance and blood pressure. It's like the body's internal hydration manager.
Okay, that makes sense. We've definitely covered a lot of ground here. Which gland is next on the list?
All right, let's talk about the pancreas. It's actually a pretty fascinating organ because it kind of wears 2 hats. It's both an exocrine gland, meaning it produces digestive enzymes, and an endocrine gland, which means it makes hormones.
It's a multitasker. So which hormones are we talking about for the endocrine side of things?
The most famous ones are insulin and glucagon, both super important for regulating blood sugar levels. Insulin's produced by beta cells in the pancreas, and it helps cells absorb glucose from the blood, which lowers blood sugar levels.
And glucagon does the opposite.
Exactly. Glucagon comes from alpha cells, and it raises blood sugar when it dips too low. Basically, it gets the liver to release stored glucose back into the bloodstream.
So it's this constant back and forth, keeping blood sugar in that healthy range. What happens when that balance is off?
That's when you get conditions like diabetes mellitus. In type 1 diabetes, the body's immune system actually attacks those beta cells, so no insulin can be produced. And in type 2 diabetes, the body becomes resistant to insulin, so the cells aren't responding to it the way they should.
It's incredible how much impact one organ can have on our health. Okay, so we've covered the hypothalamus, pituitary, pineal, thyroid, parathyroid, thymus, adrenal glands, and the pancreas. Are we missing any major players in the endocrine system?
We can't forget about the gonads, the testes in males and the ovaries in females.
Ah, yes, the stars of the reproductive show. Let's dive into those in part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive on the endocrine system. Before the break, we were just about to explore the gonads, which of course are the primary reproductive organs. The testes in males and the ovaries in females.
Right, and I think a lot of people probably just think of the gonads in terms of, well, making babies. But it sounds like they have a bigger role when it comes to hormones.
Absolutely. While the gonads are definitely essential for reproduction, they're also really important for things like developing secondary sexual characteristics and overall hormonal balance, too. So let's start by talking about the testes.
Okay, so just to be clear, the testes are located outside the abdominal cavity in the scrotum. Is there a reason for that?
That's a good question. Turns out that sperm production actually needs a slightly lower temperature than your normal body temperature. The scrotum helps to regulate the temperature of the testes, making sure the conditions are just right for sperm development.
It's amazing how our bodies just have these systems in place to make sure everything works perfectly. So, okay, the testes produce sperm, but what about hormones?
The main hormone produced by the testes is testosterone, and it belongs to this group of hormones called androgens.
Testosterone. That's the one everyone always associates with masculinity.
Well, it's true that it plays a huge role in male development and physiology. Like, during puberty, testosterone is what's responsible for those classic male secondary sex characteristics, facial and body hair, a deeper voice, increased muscle mass.
It's like the body saying, hey, look, I'm a man now. But testosterone isn't just about, looks, is it?
No, not at all. Testosterone is also crucial for sperm production, and it's what maintains libido. It even influences bone density and red blood cell production. It affects a lot of different things throughout the body.
So it's not just this, male hormone. It's really important for overall health.
Exactly. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about the ovaries, which are located in the female pelvis.
So the ovaries are responsible for producing eggs. Those are the female gametes. But what about hormones? What's happening there?
Okay, so the ovaries produce two main groups of hormones, estrogens and progesterone. Estrogen is actually a term for a few different hormones like estradiol, estriol, and estrone.
Oh, so when we say estrogen, we're talking about this whole family of hormones.
That's right. And estrogens are what cause those female secondary sex characteristics to develop during puberty. So things like breast development, the widening of the hips, and, how body fat is distributed.
Okay, so estrogens are shaping those features we typically associate with being female. What about their role in, actual reproduction?
Estrogens have a huge role in regulating the menstrual cycle. They stimulate the growth of the uterine lining, so it's ready for a potential pregnancy. If pregnancy doesn't happen, estrogen levels drop, and that's what triggers menstruation.
So it's all about preparing the body for the possibility of a baby. What about progesterone? What does it do?
Progesterone is often called the pregnancy hormone because it's what gets the uterus ready for that fertilized egg to implant, and it's what keeps the pregnancy going strong. If pregnancy does happen, progesterone levels stay high, supporting the developing fetus.
So estrogens and progesterone are working together to make the menstrual cycle happen and then to support a pregnancy, if it happens. It's kind of amazing how it all works.
It really is. And these hormones do more than just the reproduction stuff, too. For example, estrogen actually protects bone density in women.
So they're multitasking, just like some of those other glands we talked about. It makes you realize how complicated and interconnected everything is.
It really does. And, speaking of interconnectedness, before we move on, I think it's important to mention how the gonads interact with those other glands, specifically the hypothalamus and pituitary.
Okay, so how did that all work? Is there some kind of feedback loop going on there?
The anterior pituitary. Well, they actually act on the gonads. They're what stimulates the production of testosterone in males and estrogens and progesterone in females. But here's where the feedback loop comes in.
I'm all ears.
So when levels of those hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone get too high, they actually send a signal back to the hypothalamus and pituitary. It's like they're saying, hey, we've got enough here. You can slow down production of LH and FSH.
So it's like a thermostat, always adjusting to keep everything balanced.
That's a great way to put it. And that feedback loop is really, really important for maintaining reproductive health. If something messes it up, you can have problems with fertility, menstrual cycles, your whole hormonal balance can get thrown off.
It's incredible how the body's always monitoring and adjusting things, trying to keep everything running smoothly. Okay, so we've covered those major endocrine glands, including the fascinating world of the gonads. What's next on our endocrine adventure?
Well, we've spent a lot of time on those classic endocrine glands, but remember those other organs we mentioned earlier? The
Right.
ones that also produce hormones?
Oh, yeah. The heart, kidneys, even the gastrointestinal tract, they all make hormones. Can we talk more about those?
Sure. Let's start with the heart. Now, this might surprise you, but the heart isn't just a pump. It's also an endocrine organ, meaning it makes a hormone. It's called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP.
Okay, I did not know that. So what does this heart hormone actually do?
ANP is released when blood pressure gets too high, and it acts on the kidneys to basically increase sodium excretion and water loss. And that helps to lower blood pressure. It also dilates blood vessels, which also helps bring blood pressure down.
Oh, it's like the heart's own blood pressure regulator. That's so cool.
Yeah.
What about the kidneys? What hormone are they making?
The kidneys make a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. And that one's really important for producing red blood cells.
So EPO is what's making sure our bodies have enough oxygen carrying capacity.
You got it. If oxygen levels in the blood are low, the kidneys release EPO, and that stimulates the bone marrow to, make more red blood cells. And that means the blood can carry more oxygen to all the tissues.
It's like a built-in oxygen sensor and response system. Pretty amazing. Okay, what about the gastrointestinal tract? You said it makes hormones too, right? What's happening there?
Oh, the GI tract is actually a big-time endocrine organ. It produces a whole bunch of different hormones that control digestion, appetite, even mood, believe it or not. One example is gastrin, which is released when food enters the stomach.
So gastrin is what gets all those digestive juices flowing.
Exactly. Gastrin makes the stomach produce more acid and enzymes, getting it ready to break down food. Then there's secretin, which is released when this acidic, partially digested food, we call it chyme, enters the small intestine.
Secretin. What does that one do? Do they have something to do with those digestive enzymes from the pancreas?
You got it. Secretin tells the pancreas to release bicarbonate, which neutralizes that acidic chyme coming from the stomach, and it also gets the liver to produce bile, which helps digest fats.
So it's all about teamwork. The stomach, small intestine, pancreas, and liver all working together to break down food and absorb those nutrients. What other GI hormones are there?
There are a ton, but one that's worth mentioning is cholecystopenin, or CCK. It's released when fat enters the small intestine, and CCK tells the gallbladder to contract, which releases bile, so that helps with fat digestion.
Yeah.
It also signals to the brain that we're full, so it helps regulate our appetite.
Oh, so CCK is like the body's way of saying, hey, I'm good, I've had enough to eat. That's pretty cool. What other cool hormones does the GI tract have up its sleeve?
Well, there's this one called ghrelin. It's sometimes called the hunger hormone. It's mostly produced by the stomach, and it sends signals to the brain to increase appetite, so it basically makes you want to eat more.
Ah, so ghrelin is what's causing those hunger pangs when our stomach's empty, making us want to eat, like right now.
Exactly. And it shows how connected our digestive system and our brain really are. The GI tract isn't just digesting food, it's telling us when to eat and even influencing our behavior.
This is so interesting. We started with those classic glands, and now we're seeing how these other organs are producing hormones too. It really does make you see how interconnected our bodies are.
It does, and it just goes to show that hormones are involved in so much more than we realize. It's not just about growth, metabolism, reproduction. They're affecting our mood, our behavior, our overall well-being.
Okay, so we've covered those major endocrine glands and all those surprising hormone-producing organs. But how do hormones actually do their thing? Like, how do they talk to our cells and tell them what to do?
That's a great question. And to answer that, we need to talk about hormone receptors and how cells signal to each other. Let's dive into all of that in part 3 of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. We've been exploring this amazing and endocrine system. We've talked about those major glands, those other organs that are making hormones too. But now I'm really curious, how do those hormones actually work? Like at the cellular level, how do they actually tell our bodies what to do? It's like they've got this secret language or something, right?
It is a Pretty fascinating language. And the key to understanding it is, well, hormone receptors. See, hormones, they're very specific. They don't just affect every single cell they run into. They actually target certain cells that have these special proteins called receptors. And those receptors are designed to bind to very specific hormones.
So it's kind of like a lock and key. Each hormone has its own unique key, and it only fits a certain lock or receptor on a cell.
That's a great analogy. And when that hormone finds its receptor and binds to it, it kicks off all these events inside the cell. And those actions are what cause that specific response in the body.
So where are all these receptors hanging out? Are they all in the same place?
That's where things get a little more complicated, but also really interesting. You've got two main types of hormone receptors, membrane-bound receptors and intracellular receptors.
All right, break it down for me. What are membrane-bound receptors?
Well, just like the name says, they're stuck right in the cell membrane. That's the outer boundary of the cell. They're like the gatekeepers. They receive signals from hormones that can't just, pass through the cell membrane all willy-nilly.
Okay, so which hormones are we talking about here? The ones that need that gatekeeper?
Those are the hormones made up of proteins or peptides, like insulin, growth hormone, and those fight or flight hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline.
So these protein-based hormones, they can't just walk right into the cell. They need a special invitation.
You got it. They have to bind to that membrane-bound receptor first, and then that receptor passes the message from the outside to the inside of the cell. It's like knocking on the door and having someone inside actually answer.
Okay, I like that. So what happens inside the cell once that message gets through?
That's where things get really complex. But also super cool, this signal transduction often involves something called second messenger systems.
Second messengers. Okay, I'm intrigued. What are those?
Think of them as like the middlemen. They amplify and pass on the hormone signal inside the cell. One of the most common second messenger systems uses this molecule called cyclic AMP or CCAMP.
Okay, can we walk through how that actually works?
Sure. Let's use adrenaline as an example, the hormone that gets us going when we're stressed. When adrenaline binds to its receptor on the surface of the cell, it activates this enzyme called adenylate cyclase, and that enzyme sits on the inner side of the cell membrane.
Okay, so hormone binds on the outside, enzyme gets activated on the inside. What next?
So then that activated adenylate cyclase takes ATP, that's the cell's energy currency, and turns it into CAMP-MP. And that CAMP-MP is it's like a domino setting off this whole cascade of events inside the cell.
It's a chain reaction.
Exactly. With adrenaline, that chain reaction makes glycogen break down into glucose, and that gives us that quick burst of energy we need for those fight or flight situations.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, so that's how those protein-based hormones do their thing.
Mm.
What about those other receptors, the intracellular ones? What's their story?
All right, so intracellular receptors, they're actually located inside the cell, usually in the cytoplasm or the nucleus, which is, the cell's control center. These receptors bind to hormones that are lipid-soluble, meaning they can pass right through that cell membrane.
Oh, so which hormones are we talking about here? The ones that don't need a gatekeeper?
The big ones are steroid hormones, things like testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol.
So if they can just slide right through the membrane, why even have a receptor inside the cell?
Good question. Even though they can get into the cell, they still need to bind to their receptor to actually have any effect. And once they're bound together, that hormone receptor complex can go into the nucleus and actually interact directly with the cell's DNA.
Wait, they can actually change gene expression. That's pretty powerful.
It is powerful. By messing with gene expression, those steroid hormones can have really long-lasting effects on how the cell functions and develops.
So it's not just about those immediate reactions, like with adrenaline. These hormones are actually shaping who we are long-term.
That's right. They're involved in everything from regulating metabolism to how we develop sexually. Even our mood and behavior are influenced by them.
This is mind-blowing. It really gives you a new perspective on the endocrine system, just how complex and just how well designed it is.
It's an amazing system, and scientists are still figuring out all the details. But the more we learn, the more we understand how hormones really do shape our health and well-being.
I can't wait to see what they discover next. Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive. From that master gland, the pituitary, to all those surprise hormone makers, it's definitely clear that hormones are running the show, keeping our bodies working properly.
It's been a great deep dive. I hope everyone listening has a better grasp on this incredible communication network that's always at work inside us.
I know I do. Thanks for joining us for this journey into the world of hormones, everyone. Until next time, keep those brains